one time I didn't believe ghosts exist. I used to mock the statement while others embrace it. I don't believe in anything unless my eyes lay on whatever I'm looking at. At first, if someone told me anything about a ghost, I would probably make fun of them. All I would do is stand there and mock them, or well, at least that's what I used to do. It all started on a cold winter night. The wind outside was howling and the trees were scraping against my window with a nasty chalkboard scrape sound. I was inside reading a novel while listening for the doorbell to ring. My friend Quincy was coming over and we were going over to the old mansion up on Devil's Peak. Devil's Peak was supposed to be the scariest and creepiest place anybody could possibly be, or at least that is what I'm told. I was heading to my refrigerator when suddenly a loud crash came from outside. I don't know what it was, but going to open the door sent a shiver straight down my spine. I slowly reached for the doorknob when suddenly unbelievable pounding hit the front door and I fell backwards, landing on my back. The door came flying wide open and to my surprise it was Quincy. It seems he tripped and knocked over my plant, causing it to hit the ground and make the crashing sound. Quincy came barging in, telling me on his way here he heard noises coming from the old mansion on Devil's Peak. Before I replied to him, I lifted myself up and took a breather. I told him that's impossible since no one has lived there for years, but he insisted that it was true. I finally asked him what the sounds were. He told me in very specific detail that he heard a lady's scream, a baby's laughter, and a husband's cry, all in that order. At first I thought about it, then replied to him in a clear statement, "Let's go take a look at that mansion." Having to walk up the hill to Devil's Peak took a lot of energy only because the hill was huge and steep. As we grew nearer to the mansion, I started wondering if Quincy was telling the truth or lying to scare me. Either way, I would get to the bottom of whatever this so-called noise was. We finally reached the top of the hill, and to my surprise, the mansion was bigger than I expected. It was blue with white splattered paint in a few spots and had a wide double door crafted out of marble and wooden windows perfectly spread a good 5 feet away from each other. The curtains looked as if they were dusted only 5 minutes before we arrived. The house looked as if it had never been touched. Walking up to the front door, I realized Quincy was still at the top of the hill staring at the mansion. I grabbed him and told him there was nothing to be scared of, and soon afterwards we heard thunder. We both jumped and screamed, then plop, we were on our butts. As we got up and cleaned ourselves off, it started raining, so I advised we go in the mansion until the weather cleared up, and so we did. Walking into the mansion felt comforting and yet disturbing. I noticed there was some polished furniture in what seemed to be the living room. I told Quincy I was going to check it out, and he told me not wander off because there might be ghosts. I told him not to worry and that there were no such thing as ghosts. As soon as I turned around, thought I smacked my head dead on with a piece of wood hanging from the ceiling. Quincy laughed hysterically to the fact I hit my head. I waited for the pain to go away and ventured into the living room. When I entered the living room, something didn't feel right, nor did it feel bad, but something caught my eye before I thought about these feelings. It was a record player, but it didn't have the usual needle you put on the record. Instead, it had a big tuba-looking thing above it. Quincy came into the room a few minutes later, looking around, and also observed the weird record player. I told him the sound probably came out from the top. My eyes, while scanning the record player, caught a circular shape in the distance hanging off the side of the table. I walked over to it and grabbed it. Picking up the object, I could tell it was a good 50 years old, at least. Plus, to my surprise, it was a record. The names and songs on the records were scratched and faded, so I couldn't tell what kind of music it was, but I was dying to try it out. Quincy urged me to put it down because the record was delicate and could break and cut me at any time. I told him not to worry as I settled the record on the record player and listened, in horror. Quincy and I both gazed at the record player. The record did not play a song, but in its place a recording of someone's dark, deep voice. The voice sounded depressed, and by the deepness of the voice it sounded male. Anyway, the voice spoke, and not to itself, but I think us. Yes, it was us. The voice was telling us that we were now trapped and that the way to get out was to live through 3 events in the past and not only see the events, but feel them. I shut my mouth after the voice stopped talking and thought to myself, this can't be real. I did not just hear a voice from 50 years ago talk to me. While I was troubling with the fact that a voice talked to us, Quincy threw himself at the door, and to our astonishment, it was boarded up. My mouth went wide and I was speechless. We were locked inside by whatever forces kept us here, and then we heard something. I completely lost all thought of anything at the moment, and I'm guessing so did Quincy, because what we heard was phenomenal. It was a lady talking. Then, out of nowhere, shriek. A loud scream came out of all directions and shattered the windows above us by the stairwell. Then I came up with an idea. Whoever is messing with us forgot one important thing: locking the windows, or better yet, making them soundproof. I grabbed Quincy and ran up the stairs, and to my amazement, the windows weren't there anymore. Quincy gazed at the hard, solid wooden wall at where the windows were. I told him not to panic, but nevertheless he went into a panic frenzy, screaming and yelling, "We're going to die." I grabbed him and smacked him, telling him to chill. I had to think, and he wasn't helping. Then something came to me, something important. Didn't Quincy hear a lady scream before we came to the mansion? I ran to Quincy, who was against the wall in fetal position, and asked him what sounds he heard before we came here, and he replied with the very answer I didn't want to hear. He did hear a lady scream. As I dragged Quincy down the empty hallway, we heard it again, but this time clearer. The sound came from the end of the hallway, and so I ran to the other end, leaving Quincy behind, only to find something so horrible and disturbing you would cry. It was a lady, all right, who screamed, a lady with a knife through her back. I gazed in horror as she turned around and screamed, "Help me," over and over again. If that wasn't enough, she was coming closer. I couldn't move for some reason, and as soon as she was an inch from my torso, Quincy came into the room and yelled, "AL." Finally, I moved just a second before the lady reached for my shirt and I fell on my butt. I got up, turned around, and told Quincy to run, but he stared at me, pointing at my shirt. His mouth was wide open and his eyes scarred with fear. His fingers were pointing dead at me. I asked what's wrong, and he muttered something. I couldn't hear him, so I asked again, and this time he didn't need to answer because I felt a cold breeze hit my chest. I looked down and saw my shirt ripped and my chest bleeding. I thought there is no way I could have done that from falling, but from something sharp touching me, or something like fingernails. The lady ripped my shirt, but I was sure she wasn't real. She was an illusion. There was no way she was alive, or was she? Thinking of the lady, I remembered we were still in the room, so I turned around, and to my amazement, she was gone. She disappeared into thin air, just like a ghost. No, that's not possible. There are no such things as ghosts. Just then we heard another sound. This time it was a baby's laughter. Quincy stared at me, but I already knew why. It was the second sound he heard. Darting ahead of Quincy, I looked back to watch something I wish never happened. Out of nowhere, the ground collapsed under Quincy, and to my horror, I watched my best friend fall into the pits of darkness down below to his death. I tried to jump in, but I didn't have the guts. My best friend was gone. I fell to my knees and started to shed tears. I knew it was my fault. I shouldn't have let him come with me to this place. He died because of my carelessness. I screamed at the top of my lungs and smashed my fist on the ground. After I was done sobbing, I got up, said a few words for him, and started to walk away when I heard something shout from the hole. It couldn't be. It was impossible, but sure enough, the voice was clear enough for me to figure it out. It was Quincy. I rushed back to the hole and screamed his name. A few minutes later, I heard mine. He was alive, but how? I yelled down the hole, "Are you safe?" A few seconds later he replied, "And oh, I'm hanging onto a piece of wood sticking out from the wall." I cried happy tears, then realized that he won't be able to hang for long. I jumped up and looked around for something to throw to him, and I saw a curtain. Hey, it works for getting out your window, so why not now? I grabbed the curtain, tying it together to make a line, and shouted to Quincy to hold on, and what made me laugh a little is that he replied saying, "Do I have a choice?" I finished tying the curtain and lifted it down to him and told him to grab it, and so he did. He was heavier than I expected. I used all my strength to pull him up and carry him out of the hole. We sat there for a few minutes catching our breaths, and he finally turned toward me and said with the most compassion I have ever heard, "Thank you." I replied telling him no problem and that I was glad he was alive, but not long enough for us to hear another noise. I was glad and worried because what we heard was the final sound. A man was crying. Quincy and I got up with newfound courage and carefully walked toward the sound. We came into a white room filled with paintings of a woman scattered everywhere. They were on the wall, the ground, even the ceiling. We looked around and saw nobody, so we turned around and then everything went blank. 5 seconds before it went dark, I remembered a black figure standing in front of us crying and he whispering what seemed to be IMSRRY. I started waking up to a bright light. I opened my eyes and started to scream, but I couldn't. I was tied to pole, and to my right so was Quincy. It seems he was awake and fully aware of the surroundings. It was a blue room with a baby carriage, toys, a work desk, and some knitting tools. I don't know if I was dreaming, but what Quincy and I saw seemed very realistic. A lady walked into the room not noticing us and slammed the door. She turned around and watched a man, probably her husband, dart into the room. They started yelling and fighting. The husband pulled out a knife from his pocket and stabbed the lady in her back. He backed up and watched her fall on the bed. He looked toward the baby's carriage. He picked the baby up and watched as the baby laughed and smiled. He flipped open the carpet he had on the ground and dropped the baby into the hole he had hidden and started to cry. Then, poof, everything went blank again. I woke up on the porch of the mansion and saw that Quincy was starting to gain conscious also. I helped him up and we started to question each other about if what we had just seen was real. We came up with the conclusion that it wasn't real, so we briefly looked at the mansion and started walking home, and then Quincy stopped and stared in horror at my shirt. I asked him what was wrong about it, so I looked down and saw that it was still ripped.